Good afternoon and welcome to the first expert talk for this afternoon. We have been running these expert talks now for over a year, and we're really excited to start today with a talk by Dr. Ajit Bhide. I'll just briefly tell you a little bit about Green Oak and what we do. We are a community mental health center, and we've been based in Bangalore now for a couple of years. It was co-founded by myself, Jwala Narayanan, who's a neuropsychologist, and Dr. Soumya Krishna, who's a psychiatrist as well. I'm a perinatal psychiatrist and psychotherapist. And basically, we focus on outpatient work with mental illness, both severe mental illness, but also common mental illness. We have a lot of therapists, many of who are here, and we focus a lot on psychotherapies for personality disorders, neuropsychological interventions for brain disorders and dementia. And we also do group work for personality disorder, group work for enrichment programs for dementia, and group work for rehabilitation and recovery. This initiative that we've started, it's been about a year now that we invite experts from various fields and host a conversation really on different topics that may not be otherwise accessible or available to us easily. And this will go on for a couple of hours today. I'll introduce Dr. Ajit Bhide, who needs no introduction in a couple of minutes. Just a few housekeeping rules. So the way we would go about it is Dr. Bhide will do a presentation covering the topic. And that might take about 45 minutes, sir. Is that correct? Yeah.
Right. 45 minutes.
Yeah. So we have received some questions from some of you. You're welcome to post questions in the chat if you want. Dr. Bhide, would you like to be interrupted during your talk, or are you okay for us to do a question answer session too after that?
I think at the very end would be more convenient for me.
Yeah. Great. So that's what we'll do. So post your questions in the chat as we go along if you want. And once the session is finished, the second half, or a little bit more than the second half of the afternoon, will be spent on addressing those questions and making it more interactive. Some of you have in your questions given like an overview of what your, like cases that you may be working with. So your questions could be addressing that as well. Any case that you're working with, it need not be just a theoretical question.
I really would appreciate that, Ashish. I mean, specific cases make it much more lively and meaningful.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you, sir. That's what would make it more interesting. So don't hesitate to bring any case material that you have. Also, just bear in mind when you're sharing cases to keep very obvious identifiable factors anonymous. Because this is a large group and we'd like to keep things as confidential as possible. Of course, this is also a group of professionals, so I'm hoping that everyone maintains confidentiality, even if you do identify a patient, to try and keep the information within this space as best as possible. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ajit Bhide, who was the first exposure for me in mental health and my first teacher, and continues to be one of my teachers. And I'm so grateful and fortunate to be doing this introduction. He's an emeritus consultant in psychiatry at St. Martha's Hospital, Bangalore. He's a well-known and respected psychiatrist and psychotherapist. He has a lot of experience in personality disorder, youth mental health, psychosomatic medicine, psychotherapy, and preventive psychiatry. He was the president of Indian Psychiatric Society from 2018-2019. And actively vocal about the mental health of LGBTQ community. He has a keen interest in literature and drama, and that makes him really popular at both public and professional events. He has been associated with the Medical Pastoral Association called the MPA, which is a pioneering NGO in Bangalore for over 2 decades. I think he's been working with them, and he's this is just a very small snippet of all the things that he's been doing. And I'm really grateful to him because I can just reach out to him and harass him with all the little queries that I might have since moving back. And he's always been obliging. So I'm excited to hear him speak today. So over to you, Dr. Ajit. I'll just share the
And I cherish our professional relationship as much as you do. And I dare say that I've gained a lot from interacting with you. I'm very proud of you as one of my prize students who has achieved so much after having left us. Ashisha was with us in St. Martha's Hospital. Was it 98, 99, 2000, somewhere around there?
2001, 2002. Yeah.
Right. And then she's super specialized in so many forms of psychotherapy. I reach out to her whenever I do need both to refer cases as well as to get some guidance on how specifically to deal with this. Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm delighted to be here to speak on a topic that's very, very dear to my heart. I'll speak a little about how I got drawn to this topic. Actually, I got drawn to this topic during my internship more than any other time, when I was working in the Department of Surgery. And it has remained very dear to me, the entire topic of child abuse generally. But more specifically, as I learned more about child abuse, I discovered that one area of abuse that is very difficult to define, but nonetheless it attends on so many patients, so many young people's lives, is emotional abuse. And I've been pursuing this matter of emotional abuse with some degree of devotion, if I might say alacrity. And I find that emotional abuse almost always, I should say always, accompanies every other form of abuse. I also want to humbly submit that, unlike Ashisha and many of you, I don't have any super qualifications. I am just an MD psychiatry. I'm very proud of the fact that I'm a homegrown Bangalore, if I may say, boy. And I relish my association with Bangalore and with my institutions. That's the St. Joseph's School, the St. John's Medical College, very, very importantly, NIMHANS, and most recently, when we were undergraduates, we did not have a medical college at St. John's, and we used St. Martha's Hospital. And I'm very glad to have been there for close to 4 decades now. And I continue there now as an old 4G. We can't let go of each other, St. Martha's and I. So I am now what is called, I've been kicked upstairs to a lovely position that gives me a little pomp and show, since no other institution gave me that. So I'm now an emeritus consultant over there. Enough about myself, but I'd like to still dwell on how I got drawn to this topic. During my internship, there was a young child, I think it was about 8 months old boy, who was brought, and my unit chief, and at that time the head of the department, Dr. Ajit Joseph, introduced me to something I was not even aware existed. That is, he brought a set of instruments called dilators for the esophagus. And we had to gently but definitely dilate this child's esophagus. And this was done over a number of sessions for the duration of my posting in surgery, which was at that time 2.5 months. And it was, on the one hand, very mind-boggling, on the other hand, fascinating, because as doctors, we have to be somewhat detached. But the story that came about, that I learned, shook me up completely. So this was the child of a father who belonged to the goldsmith community. And what he had done in a fit of rage was take the awful mixture of acids that goldsmiths use and put it down this child's mouth. Because he was very irritated that the child kept on crying and would not acquiesce no matter what he tried. And in that fit of rage, he had done this damage. He was not drunk, but he did this damage. And I was appalled at what methods of disciplining can be adopted by frustrated, angry parents. And that awakened in me the interest in understanding child abuse. And this, of course, was a physical form of abuse. By the time they came to us, at least what I got to see was this father was extremely remorseful. He wept his heart out when he narrated the story to me 2 days after the first dilatation that I had witnessed and partly participated in. And he was full of remorse, but the damage had been done. And I followed up this case for 4 years into my post-graduation and learned that this child had grown up into a mentally challenged young individual. Not surprising at all, given the amount of damage this child had undergone. And mind you, I'm talking about the late 70s, early 80s. I followed this child into what was called the mental retardation clinic at that time, now called the intellectual disability clinic at NIMHANS. And we saw this child. But after that, I have lost touch. So that awakened my interest. And from here, we'll go on to the specific topic for today, invisible bruises, understanding emotional abuse of children and the aftermath of such abuse. Next slide, please. I'll start with a little poem, and I'll tell you about the poet at the very, very, very end. Who will cry for the little boy, lost and all alone? Who will cry for the little boy, abandoned without his own? Who will cry for the little boy? He cried himself to sleep. Who will cry for the little boy he never had for keeps? Next. Sorry, Ashish, I'll have to go on with this next because my slide share is not working. Who will cry for the little boy? He walked the burning sand. Who will cry for the little boy? The boy inside the man. This is something which should strike us, because the boy inside the man means there is a carryover of this awful hurt that young people have to undergo right into their adulthood, very, very commonly. Who will cry for the little boy who knows well, hurt and pain? Who will cry for the little boy? He died and died again. Cowards die many times before their death, said Shakespeare, but here these people go through very, very mortifying experiences over and over again. It's like a fresh death each time. Next. Who will cry for the little boy, a good boy he tried to be? Who will cry for the little boy who cries inside of me? The tears that are there, the anguish that is there, the angst that is there, is contained within and sometimes not allowed to be demonstrated, let alone spill over. Here we move on to the spectrum of child abuse. And for convenience, we have divided these into 6 phenomena over here. Child abuse or neglect of children by parents. And this happens quite commonly in particularly the 2 extremes of social strata. Parents do not have the wherewithal to engage with their children, perhaps because of economic reasons, that both parents are out busy earning livelihood for the family, including the children. Or at the other extreme, they are so busy with their social life, their kitty parties, their socializing, they're working especially in capitalist societies, working to get more and more and more resources, sometimes claimed for the family, but they don't have time to spend with the child, and the child gets neglected. This is a gross form of abuse. Physical abuse, like the Goldsmith's child that I talked to you about. And there are other forms of very, very dire physical abuses. These are usually in the form of punishment, and we'll have something to say about it a little later if we have the time. Physical abuse in the form of injuries, actual physical injuries, and those are the bruises that can be seen. Emotional abuse, our specific focus for today, about which we'll have a lot more to say soon. Sexual abuse, to which we have awakened in the last 2.5, 3 decades, quite rightly so, and it is getting at least some attention. Incidentally, this is the only area where we have a definite law. The law has its merits and demerits. We won't have the time to go into that because I'm not dealing so much with sexual abuse. Suffice it to say that sexual abuse without emotional abuse just does not occur. Then, again, because of economic reasons, most commonly, children are driven to supplement the family income, and we engage in child labor. Though we now have stringent laws against child labor, you can see it on the periphery of the city. Very, very unlikely you'll see it in the heart of the city anymore. And you can see it a lot more in the rural area where child labor goes on. And child labor is something which deprives the child of the kind of attention and nurturance that she or he needs. And that is another form of gross abuse of childhood. Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Dr. Munchausen was a baron of great courageous achievement and a soldier of no small merit, but also he had a tendency to exaggerate his stories. And in medicine, we have this syndrome named by a physician actually who was deeply interested in mental health, called Richard Asher, which is called the Munchausen syndrome. Now, Munchausen syndrome by proxy speaks about feigned or pretended illness or faked illness, which a mother will bring a child to medical attention for some bleeding disorder or some cough which is not going away, or complains of bowel symptoms, or complaining of that the child has pain when the child actually has no pain at all. She is striving to gain attention for the child, but the main problem is mainly with her. So here the Munchausen syndrome, which is a syndrome of exaggerated stories, is actually done by a parent, most commonly the mother, and most commonly with a very, very small child, very rarely with a child beyond 5 years of age. We will not have time to get into any of these. We will today focus hugely on emotional abuse. Next slide, please. Now, child abuse consists of any act. We are generally speaking about abuse. We're not speaking about emotional abuse just yet. Any act or failure to act that endangers a child's physical or emotional health and development. Someone is abusive if he or she fails to nurture the child physically, injures the child, physically injures the child, or relates sexually to the child, very importantly, at an improper age. Next. Emotional abuse is any attitude, behavior, or failure to act that interferes with a child's mental health and mental development mental development, of course, is closely linked to social development. It can range from simple verbal insults to extreme forms of punishment. And this punishment can, again, be purely verbal, or it may be accompanied by caning or other physical insults. Emotional abuse is almost always present when another form of abuse is found. This particular statement, the last one, I might keep repeating. Please bear with me because I think it's very, very important to remember that emotional abuse in isolation does occur, but it always accompanies other forms of abuse, the ones we referred to, including physical abuse. Neglect is a slightly gray area, and sexual abuse. Next. Surprisingly, emotional abuse, when it occurs in isolation, can have more long-lasting negative psychiatric effects than either physical or sexual abuse, which are accompanied, of course, by some emotional abuse. But if the physical component is dominant or the sexual component is one of seduction rather than force, then the emotional abuse long-term sequelae are much, much more surprising. Next. While the definition of emotional abuse is often complex and not difficult to make it very, very precise, we must realize that for most parents, occasional negative attitudes or actions, which is to say that it's not that every form of punishment, every form of grounding the child or giving the child time out should be considered as emotional abuse, because we are not here to say that disciplining is completely out of place, far from it. Even the best of parents have occasions when they have momentarily lost control, yelled at your kids, for instance, and said hurtful things to the children. Get out of here. I don't know why you're around at all. Now, that's a kind of statement that I think many of us might have indulged in. Confession, I have, or unintentionally scared them by their actions. So these little infringements, so to say, are not to be considered emotional abuse. Am I excusing myself? Perhaps tongue-in-cheek I am. Next. Every form of abuse actually has an emotional component, and it is this component that is of great importance to us in the mental health professions. Why? Because that emotional abuse is received, it sort of incubates in the mind, and if not enough redressal is meted out, then it grows in the child, sometimes even cancerously, I might say, metaphorically speaking, of course, and it multiplies and it makes a home there, which can then be take the form of a grudge that is held against the person who has perpetrated the abuse, very commonly a parent, or it can shape the entire outlook of this child in the long run. It may also cause a lot of emotional upheavals that amount to mental illness. We'll say more about that as we go along. Now, child abuse in India. Now, there were studies which were rather rudimentary until this particular study came up. And I must say that Mrs. Renuka Chaudhary, the Minister for Child and Women's Welfare, was the one who commissioned this survey. It was not a huge survey given us the size of our population. We had touched 1 billion by then. The first national study of child abuse covering 13 states and a sample size of about 12,500 children. These children were aged between 5 and 18 years. So you have young children, you have school-going children largely, and you have adolescents, and I are changing definitions. At that time, we wouldn't call them adults, we'll call them late adolescents. This was released by this ministry in April. Previous slide, please. Previous one. Yeah. Released by the ministry in 2007, says that 53% of children had faced some kind of abuse. Now, that's a very significant number by any standards. This was something put out by the ministry, and look at this, the statistics put out by them. The national average for physical abuse is 68.87. When you break it up gender-wise, it is 54 and 50, let's say almost 55 and 45. The percentage of young children who have been abused, in their definition, since they had the range of 5 to 18, between 5 and 12, it was 65. Children between 13 and 14, 19. And adolescents, 15 to 18, almost 16%. What does this tell you? If anyone would like to venture an answer. Almost the same phenomenon obtains for other forms of abuse also. The emotional abuse is the only exception, but there's something strange about these statistics. It struck me as soon as I got this from the ministry, and they were talking about how we are silent about abuse. And I think that was a very, very warranted statement. But let's look at our statistics. Don't just follow whenever people come up with impressive tables and charts, pie charts, we get impressed by that. But there's something wrong over here, right? Anyone wants to venture to answer?
The younger the child, the more abused they are.
On the one hand, yes, but there's something glaringly wrong with this chart, as far as I can see. Especially, let's focus on physical and severe sexual abuse. I don't know what severe. Yeah, they define. If it was just eve teasing, it was not considered that grave sexual abuse. So actual physical contact, from penetrative sex right up to fondling without consent, all these were severe sexual abuse. Absolutely. Bhushan tells us that the average is wrong, because if you look at the national averages, they are in both these instances for physical and severe sexual abuse higher than any of the other figures. It just does not make sense. If you have an average, you'd want exactly, the numbers don't add up, says PKR. The numbers just don't add up. So there's something wrong. I don't think it's deliberate. And I think the breakup has been sincerely done. But how they came up to this national average is something I wrote to them. And of course, whenever it's an embarrassing detail, Mrs. Chaudhary's ministry did not bother to answer. Let's move on. By the way, I have no political affiliations, and I refrain from saying that. But I'm very pleased with the fact that Mrs. Chaudhary did order this investigation. And of course, whenever we come up with something, she was on national TV, and that's how we came to know that this is happening. Other names for emotional abuse are verbal abuse, let's not rush. Verbal abuse, mental abuse, and psychological maltreatment or psychological abuse. Various terms have been favored by various workers in the field. Suffice it to say that emotional abuse, to me, is the most complete rubric that I would go by. Next. Now let's look at the shapes that it takes. Emotional abuse takes various forms. Next. This is the whole spectrum again. We spoke about the spectrum of child abuse. Now let's look at the intimidation, scaring a child by threatening him or her. Next. Shaming and belittling the child, making the child feel small, making the child feel guilty, making the child feel ashamed of himself or herself, making the child feel less capable than he actually is. An actual deprivation of affection. And all of us know that children need a lot of affection for their healthy growth in every respect, not only emotionally, but definitely emotionally. Habitually blaming children for things going wrong. Ignoring the child or rejecting the child. And this happens quite commonly, especially when there is parental psychopathology. Though ignoring and rejecting can also very much occur in the context of school or other places where the child has to go for the extracurricular activities. Extreme forms of punishment. The path to hell, they say, is paved with good intentions, and it applies nowhere more appropriately than in the context of punishing children. The one who metes out punishment, most commonly, I won't say always, has the good of the child at heart, but indulges in such a form of punishment that amounts to emotional abuse. Also, insensitively, the child gets exposed to violence within the family, within the neighborhood, when we should actually prevent the child's exposure to such violence, especially at the tender ages below 12. The children should not have to see violence even in the neighborhood, but we don't pay enough attention to this. Over the last 1.5 decades, it is not 1.5, 2.5 decades, people have become more sensitive. And even when you are watching a TV show or a film, you get a warning saying that this may not be suitable for young children to view. And I think that's a move forward to protect our children from being exposed to horrendous stuff that they are best not exposed to. Exploitation. Exploiting children, as we mentioned, sending them out to earn money for themselves or their upkeep, or most commonly to contribute to the family income. And even more sordid is the occurrence of sending children out to earn money by engaging in sexual activity, prostitution. We would think that prostitution mainly occurs with girl children, but no. Some boys are also sent out to engage in prostitution because we know that the preference for sexual partners can vary massively. So labor and prostitution are clear forms of exploitation. There are other subtle forms of exploitation. Next. And then taking a child away, sometimes one parent fighting with the other parent, having lost a battle, takes the child completely away from the other parent. And this parental alienation syndrome is something which is well defined. It has been argued that it does not exist, but my feeling is it does. Also, children can be abducted by grandparents. Children can, is there any way we can prevent the chat box questions from springing up like this? I don't know. So abduction of children is another form of abuse. Sometimes there is no actual emotional maltreatment per se in the form of harsh statements or physical abuse, but this abduction itself works on the child's mind so badly. I have seen the after effects of such abduction in very many cases in my clinical practice. Next. To go by mnemonics, and which is very useful for postgraduates and those who are wanting mnemonics. This mnemonic I devised during my teaching days. It's RICE. So isolating. Isolating means isolating the child from the circumstances that would allow for his healthy growth, isolating the child from good peer interaction, isolating the child from extracurricular activities, isolating the child from one parent, not necessarily with the abduction that I just recently referred to. Threatening the child, intimidation we already spoke about. So threatening the child with dire consequences, threatening the child with a doomsday kind of prophecy if he or she does not engage in the kind of behavior which is expected of this child. I remember as a child, when I was very young, and those were days when we were not at all sensitive to the issue of child abuse. And for some time, I had to stay with my, all three of us children, were staying with my grandmother in Pune. And at that time, we were supposed to say our evening prayers, and I did not want to say them. I did not want to memorize the prayer. They're very beautiful prayers, and I have no hassles about saying them now. But at that time, we were, and my grandmother, hatash hoke, helplessly, she said, if you don't say your prayers now, me tula dag denge. A dag dena is something which means you take a hot instrument, usually at the end of a ladle or a spoon, and you scald the child with that end. That I'm going to do this to you. Now that is a kind of threat. In our zamana, it was quite common. If today anybody said that, they may be hauled before the court for engaging in child abuse. Sordid forms of disciplining which are related to these kind of threats, especially very harsh disciplining, deprivations that are out of proportion to what the child needs to be, or what behavior of the child needs correction, rejecting the child, not at all giving him the due importance he has, or keeping him away from the domain of attention that the child deserves in any healthy family. And the family may not be healthy, and yet the child can be given plenty of feel-good memes and messages, but they are deprived of that as well. Related to rejecting is totally ignoring the child. Then corrupting the child by exposing him to stuff that is not his brain and his mentation are not yet ready to take up, and corrupting the child in this fashion. And finally, of course, already said a number of times, exploiting the child for personal gain, or allegedly for his personal improvement, sending him out to earn money and so forth. So these more or less summarize what are the different forms of abuse that take place. But let's get a little more specific in certain domains. Next. Verbal barrage, the amount of verbal abuse that is heaped, and this necessarily amounts to emotional abuse. We mentioned that verbal abuse is sometimes used as a synonym for emotional abuse. You see the little fellow over here who's had to face a number of labels, negative labeling, lazy, stupid, dumb, bad. This is the kind of things that go on. Now, labeling occurs on the background of harsh statements that are rebukes, scolding the child, abusive language, including unparliamentary and unsavory words, scatological words, referring to excreta and so forth, are quite commonly used by unscrupulous parents. Then statements undermining a child's worth. Tu to kuch kar hi nahi payega. Yenappa nino nin kainda agodilla gottu nange sumne hogbeda jimge. Now that kind of statement is quite common, and something which we need to combat quite devotedly. Yelling at a child, especially yelling repeatedly. Once in a while, if you happen to yell at a child, I said it need not amount to emotional abuse, but if you're doing it repeatedly, and that's your style of dealing with a child, there is something going wrong. And children have come to me saying that, Amma, as soon as my mother comes, I want to cover up my ears because I know she's going to start yelling at me. And the yelling is, in this particular case, she was actually yelling because she is frustrated with the husband who's an alcoholic. This child has developed depression because of witnessing a lot of unpleasantness in the house. But her reflex reaction is cover my ears as soon as mother's anywhere in the vicinity, because I'm going to get yelled at. In Sanskrit, there is a lovely, Sanskrit is full of wisdom. I'm sure most of our languages are. Agni dahadapi vishishtam vakparusham, which says, angry words scorcher worse than fire. And the kind of verbal abuse that is heaped on some children, making them feel so small, worthless, even suicidal. And we'll see that in the next slide. I wish you were never born. How I wish you would die. These are kind of statements that have been made to young people. We think this is said in a fit of fancy, a fit of ire, a fit of irritation, a fit of extreme frustration on the part of the parent. Slightly understandable maybe, but not, to my mind, excusable. Research that came to us, I think, first from Argentina. I might be making a small mistake because I do get confused with the South American states, but somewhere in South America, I think it is Argentina, a group of child psychiatrists over there, first brought this to our attention, that such statements can be the nidus, the starting point of a person's feeling of unworthiness to remain alive. And that sows the seed for suicidal behavior later in life. If I'm not mistaken, Shekhar Sheshadri and his team at NIMHANS also speak about this particular phenomenon, which was first identified about 15 years before they found it to be true in India. And I subsequently, having learned from Shekhar, have found that this is very much true of many of our young suicides. That's Kiran Kher addressing these kind of statements to, if I'm not mistaken, Sonam Kapoor in a particular movie, but that's just to drive home the point. These kind of verbally devastating statements are something quite avoidable or necessary to avoid for us to have healthy mental growth in our young people. Next slide, please. Now let's look at why, in the first place, does it occur at all? Why should there be emotional abuse? Now, one thing that can happen is isolation from the family or community can contribute to emotional abuse occurring. In other words, sometimes it can be unintentional and unwitting. Next. Physical or mental health problems, especially in the perpetrator of this abuse, a mother who is depressed, a father who has a substance abuse disorder, somebody in the family who has very severe anxiety. Sometimes unintentionally, they will manifest this behavior and drive the child to a feeling of inadequacy. I remember one anxious mother who was dealing with a child, and her anxiety, because she hadn't studied much, was continuously about, will my child do well? This was a very bright child who was doing reasonably well in studies, topping a couple of subjects, but she said, no, you better go for tuitions for this. Call relatives who are school teachers and say, please look after my child. Please teach him physics and maths since those are the subjects you're very good at. And such kind of behavior on the part of the mother, who had an anxious personality and very likely also had an anxiety disorder, can contribute to a subtle form of emotional abuse occurring. Next. Of course, alcohol and drug use lay the ground for an unstable family environment. And increasingly, we are seeing that we have both parents indulging in such habits, which makes the situation obviously doubly worse. Then personal problems such as marital conflict, unemployment, financial difficulties, all these impose stress in the caregiver's life, and they wittingly or unwittingly dissipate their frustration from the stress onto the children. And then the kind of times we are living in, the cruel times we are living in a sense, extreme or unusual psychological stress, as in the present pandemic. People have had to undergo emotional upheavals. They've had to have economic upheavals. Many have lost their jobs. Many are tired of working from home, or they have had their salaries compromised. They have had difficult situations in the house where everybody has to share that little space that is there in a two-bedroom apartment. 4 or 5 people have to all be given gadgets to be able to attend their classes or attend to their work, so they're working from home. And that imposes not a small amount of stress in people's lives. And the easiest target always to get rid of frustration, who do we look for? We look for weaker people. And who are the commonest weaker people? The commonest weaker people are children, especially young children. But watch out, because sometimes the child's sense of autonomy can get the better of this kind of abuse, but more about that a little later. There are also social and cultural factors, upbringing styles. I remember one of my favorite teachers in psychiatry, a gentleman who's no more, told me about his father. And his father was a very eminent physician himself. And I had occasion to meet him. And I had said that your son is such a bright person. He's my guru. He's taught me so much. अरे यार आप क्या कह रहे हो? हम आपको बताएं कि इसे मार पीट कर डॉक्टर बनाया. मार पीट कर डॉक्टर नहीं बनाते, आज वो तो कहाँ होता पता नहीं है, कॉलेज से भी भाग जाया करता था. I hope it's all right for me to use the vernacular from time to time. And I was shocked to learn this. My teacher was, of course, suitably embarrassed, but also made light of it. But I think that's the kind of thing, because we believe that this kind of upbringing is necessary, that we have to coerce our children, we have to push our children, we have to punish our children to get somewhere important in life. Norms regarding punishment have also changed. It was quite common in my days for us to be caned publicly sometimes in the assembly, but this is no longer going to be tolerated. So we had notions like spare the rod and spoil the child. And of course, in my mother tongue, the standard line was, Chhadi lage chham chham vidya yehi gham gham. In other words, if you are going to imbibe knowledge, if you're going to get education, it is very, very important that you be flogged. Now, socioeconomic status also is an important determinant of what kind of upbringing the child will undergo. Again, we mentioned in a different context earlier that at the two extremes of society, the very, very poor and the very, very rich, we find that different forms of neglect do occur. Here we are talking about styles of parenting. In a frustrated small tenement that so many poor-to-do families have to live with, they have so much poverty to combat. They have no time to be considerate to the children, and they engage in a lot more of physical disciplining. They behave like martinets towards their children, and the children stand in terror of the parents. Also, there are other cultural factors. We know the kingdom of Sparta. We speak about Spartan living as living on sort of a minimalism, but there are other interesting stories about Sparta. In Sparta, because they wanted to survive from other small Greek kingdoms, this was in the well before Christ era, they had harsh styles of child upbringing. In fact, after a male child was born and the child became a toddler, first of all, the child was inspected by elders, keeping the mother far away. If the child had any kind of physical deformity, the physician would attend to it and say, this is curable or not curable. Incurable physical disabilities were met with killing the child, or throwing the child actually away out, or the parents could compromise and say the child will be brought up differently in a different setup to grow up into a slave who will then do only menial jobs, but will not be fit to be a proper citizen. And all proper citizens had to be fighters. Men, women, particularly men, from a very young age were groomed to become soldiers, groomed to go to the front and fight the enemy. Most interestingly, and to me appallingly, children who were able-bodied, once they had reached the age of beginning to walk, they were shown a path, a slightly barren area away from the village, 4 or 5 times. Then on a particular, I don't know whether it was auspicious, certainly not for the child, particular day, the child, single child, mind you, not in a group, used to be kept at that point, the destination, and expected to come back to the village on his own. If the child comes back, he's welcomed with a great hullabaloo, and the occasion is celebrated. The child is welcome. He is now a potential soldier. If the child doesn't come back, if animals attack the child is expected to defend himself. If he does not defend himself, just too bad. And again, mothers were locked up because mothers used to holler saying, please don't do this to my child. But over a period of time, in most of the Spartan villages, women gave up and said, this is the norm of the place. So that's the kind of cultural norms that we have to live with. Norms, as I mentioned earlier, have changed over the times. And today we live in a psychologically highly sensitive age. Working in child psychiatry in NIMHANS very early, I had to face this quite a lot. I used to talk about healthy parenting, then a favorite topic. And now, of course, everybody runs seminars on this and people pay through their noses to attend workshops on healthy parenting. But when I used to give such advice, the father or mother used to say, Doctor, whatever you're telling us makes sense to me, but my mother is there. Would you care to talk to her? So I'd have occasion to meet this matriarch. Very rarely the patriarch would come in and say, what is all this psychological stuff you're talking about? I gave my kids good whacks and they turned out to be all right. It was tough dealing with such grandmothers who were also disciplinarians. I don't doubt the nobility of their intention. I don't doubt the affectional competence of these people. But I had to tell them that, listen, Ajit, at a time when when you were young, you probably read by oil lamps. Today we have electricity. Are you going to say that electricity is not necessary at all because oil lamps were doing the job in your childhood? Let's be a little more sensitive. I succeeded many times, but I must confess that sometimes I could not meet with that success. Next. Frustration? When we look at the antecedent factors that contribute to child abuse, let's look at parental factors, and they can be very many. Parental personalities themselves. Sometimes parents are by nature very mesomorphic. They're the muscular types who cannot but use their physical power to start disciplining the child. And this is an unfortunate occurrence, which I've seen even today is fairly prevalent, unfortunate. But the style in which the parent was brought up is somehow consciously and more importantly, subconsciously picked up. And that is why abuse begets abuse. We'll say more about that later if we have the time. And parent style of the way he was brought up or she was brought up is the style she is very likely going to impose, going to adopt as his or her style of parenting and parental disciplining. Psychiatric illness in the parent, most commonly depression, severe psychotic illness. I'm right now dealing with a 21-year-old lady who's been with me for the last 7 years, whose father has this habit of using very unparliamentary abuse. He just lets fly on the entire family. The family includes his senior citizen parents, one sister who stays with the family. His wife abandoned the family because she could not take the abuse anymore. And this person who's my patient. To this day, periodically, he has to let fly the foulest of abuses on various people. And if there has been any frustration for him, the frustration can be as simple as he does not get his favorite dish. The sad part of the story is this person is in NIMHANS being treated for schizophrenia over years and years. The family have made their peace, and now this young lady has also learned to cope with this kind of abuse that the father undergoes. The father was brought to me for treatment. For a short while, he had disengaged from the abusive behavior. We hit it off well. We talked about old Kannada movies a little, and that seemed to put him at ease. But afterwards, he says, what's the point in going to the doctor? All he'll tell me is not to shout. I don't want to go to the doctor. Fortunately, with the treatment at NIMHANS, his psychosis, it appears, is a little better. Chronic physical illness or a physical disability may also impose on the parent a sense of immense frustration and limitation that causes him, again, as I said, take out your frustration on the weaker one, you'd never go for the stronger one. So chronic physical illness or disability becomes the reason why a young person is subject to emotional, to abuse in general and emotional abuse in particular. Sometimes in a family that has otherwise done well, life events and stresses that have acutely come in, have acutely got exacerbated. We did mention the instance of our current scourge, the COVID pandemic. These can also contribute to the occurrence of emotional abuse. Some families have no clear idea about what constitutes abuse and what is healthy and what is not healthy and how we need to change with the times. And these notions of abuse being pathological can contribute to the occurrence of abuse in certain families. Next. The abuser most commonly is a parent or a step parent. Of course, we have these classical stereotypes of step parent. The stepmother particularly is considered to be one extremely cruel person. And indeed, that does obtain in life fairly often. But now, with a psychological sensitive age, I find that a lot of step parents are psychologically sensitive and willing to take on the burden quite well. Closer home, I've seen some cases where extreme abuse occurs from a step parent after having been committed to not being a cruel person, even having befriended the child, especially after the step parent has an offspring of one's own. That's when abuse of the firstborn from another parent, whom this person has replaced now, can occur. And this is not at all an uncommon experience for many clinicians, I'm sure. Older siblings, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and other elders in the family are also common perpetrators of this kind of abuse. Authority figures, teachers. I know of one young person who is now a financial analyst and doing very well in life abroad, in Bangalore, in a prestigious school. This child was an extremely shy individual. My story is not from the time she was a child, because I came to know of her much later in life. She came to me as an adult patient. Because she was shy, and though she was bright in knowing answers in the to questions asked in the class, she was very nervous that she'd make a mistake. She was made to stand in the dustbin placed behind the blackboard, which was on an easel, repeatedly. So much so, the teacher would sometimes walk into class and say, let's call her Meera. Meera, which is your place? Come on, get into your place. It became a bit of a class joke. This child was petrified of this particular teacher. But teachers, there are other horrid instances. I'm sure many of you in clinical practice would know. The teachers can be perpetrators of severe abuse. And I don't know, they go through so much training. They are taught to be sensitive to children's needs. Some teachers, without even doing a course in counseling, do very well as counselors. I've noticed that as well. But teachers, if they're not sufficiently sensitive to the young mind and what their verbal blows can do to the esteem of a child. This young lady had to be in treatment for about 4 or 5 years. And even now, she occasionally has the nightmares of the maltreatment by the teacher. Next. Abuse by peers also occurs. Bullying, especially by the stronger, the older, the senior children towards the younger children. But today, we won't have time to deal with that. So I'm going to leave bullying completely out of it in today's context. Often there is a great sense of frustration on the part of the abuser. And this sense of frustration is not directly related to the child's behavior at all. That's the point I'd like to emphasize. Child's bad behavior begets frustrated reaction from adult, somewhat understandable. Again, forgivable and understandable is a distinction I would like to make. But often there is a great sense of frustration which has nothing to do with the child's behavior. It's frustration coming from somewhere else. In psychology, we have this thing called, concept of defense mechanisms. The frustration is displaced onto the young person for absolutely no fault of his or her. The other thing that happens in, I already mentioned the context of divorce, and where suddenly your own progeny is much more precious to the step parent, and therefore the abuse is heaped on the child born of an earlier marriage. And this we encounter clinically in many instances. Sorry, I'm repeating myself. Let's move on. Antecedent factors, the child. And when we look at child factors, I cannot but think of Balakrishna. Balakrishna, who was tied to the pounding ukri, as we call it in Marathi. I forget what it is. The pounding in the pounding of grain. The child was tied. Krishna became Damodara because his stomach was tied to this instrument where the rice used to be pounded. And Krishna, I think, was largely a prototype of a hyperkinetic child from what descriptions obtained. But let's not go into religious mythology for the time being. We know that children grow up with certain innate qualities. There is a personality, which we call a temperament in the context of a child, and temperamental traits, especially a highly demanding child, a child who is highly irritable, is much more likely to be abused, as in the case of the goldsmith's child that I started out with. I mentioned the story from 1979 when I was an intern. And the children who are going to get on their parents' nerves are much more likely to be subject to abuse. Then children can have their own pathology. We are speaking, of course, of psychopathology, and nowhere is this more relevant than in externalizing disorders. Children who by nature tend to be boisterous, tend to question authority from quite early in life. Then you have the hyperkinetic kids who cannot sit still in one place. And you have autistic children. For most people, it's very difficult to understand what autism is all about. And this kind of psychopathology, externalizing disorders, hyperkinetic children, and ADHD in other words, and children who have autism are prone to abuse considerably more than children who do not have such pathology. Also, it isn't as though any form of pathology exempts a child from being abused. Anxious children are abused because the parent is frustrated. I've done my best to make you less tense. What the hell is happening? How much more can I do for you? Is a kind of picture that emerges when you're dealing with the parents of many anxious children. So anxiety, depression, all of them contribute. But those three particularly are much more prone to be subject to abuse. Physical demands made by the child. And this can be in the context of a disability. It can be in the context of an acute illness. It can be in the context of chronic illness like asthma. And these children, because they make repeated demands on the parent, not necessarily in an ungraceful way, but they become subject to abuse because it is getting more and more frustrating for the adult to be able to look after this child. So actually it is, though we say child factors, it is an illness in the child, but an incompetent parent at some level who perpetrates the abuse. Sometimes we must be aware of this. Abuse can also occur because the parents are hugely ignorant. I've already alluded to that in the context of notions of abuse, but because parents are not sensitive to the phenomenon of abuse, well-meaning though they be, they end up making the child very miserable. Other unwitting, sometimes as I mentioned, the abuse is occurring without the parents meaning to be abusive, parental or intrafamilial conflict, fights that occur in the family. I remember the story told to me early in my days in child psychiatry by a child saying, "Doctor uncle, all I tell them no is don't fight, no, please don't fight." So the father broke down and said, "Okay, whatever our differences are, we take it elsewhere." "No, Papa, you may kill her." I mean, these are the kind of stories that build up in the child's imagination. Why do you think I would kill her? "I heard you say that day that if you don't behave, you'll kill her." Now that the pathology in the parents was there. Let's not necessarily say pathology. Their conflict was something quite peripheral and different from what I was dealing with. But this child was so anxious, so full of angst and drawn inwards when he opened up to me. It took me 2 sessions to get him to open up and talk this much. But that impression is clearly deeply rooted in my mind. Children who are exposed to this kind of conflict, even if the parents are very nice to the child themselves, are actually abusing the child emotionally because they have scant respect for what the child is able to and not able to handle. Then parental alcoholism, a father who comes drunk, a father who bellows when he arrives on the weekend after an evening out with the boys, or sometimes by himself also having got drunk, causes terror to be generated in the family, sometimes because the wife is upset, sometimes because, the mother is upset, but it can be even without that. And if he goes on and on and on, and he hurls abuse for the general world, not necessarily at the child at all, but the child does get affected. Sometimes unsupervised peer interactions. Well-meaning parents have allowed the child to associate with peers. That's why it's important that parents befriend their children. I always say parents should be friendly with their children, but should not reduce themselves to become friends of the children. That's a very wrong thing. Many people, so many times mothers will come and say, or fathers more than mothers will come and say that we are like friends. So I said, you should be friendly, but please don't be a friend to your child. But more importantly, I think parents need to know what kind of children are being, what kind of children is their child associating with. The peer interactions, a brief overview is enough. There are some parents who go about this with a magnifying glass and want to know every interaction that happens, which is the other extreme, necessarily to be avoided. Then, of course, there is parental absenteeism. There is parents who have totally run away from their duty as parents, sometimes unwittingly, because they're very busy hoping to make that extra packet which will help them to have a holiday abroad or buy a new vehicle and so forth, but the parent is just not present. And this is again an unwitting form of emotional abuse by a parent. Next. So what are the consequences of abuse? Emotional abuse, these are the signs. Suspect if the child shows apathy, withdrawal from emotional interaction, with overt sadness, tearfulness, extreme anxiety, and sometimes phobic symptoms, that is anxiety focused on specific areas, particularly phobia for social interaction and phobia for particular domains of activity that children would normally seem to enjoy, cognitive problems, not being able to do well in studies, not being able to sustain attention, psychobiological dysfunction in the form of sleep disturbance, appetite disturbance, lowered energy levels, excretory functions. We all know that secondary enuresis, that is bedwetting occurring after the child has gained good bladder control, occur in the background of emotional abuse. It's not the only cause, but this is something we should always be alert to. Sleep disturbance, particularly in the form of nightmares, recurrent bouts of waking up, and insomnia. These are the typical sleep disturbances. Diminished appetite, sometimes a ravenous appetite going on, even to cause obesity, which we'll mention shortly. These are biological dysfunctions that should alert you to the possibility there's something going wrong inside the clockwork of the child. Hostility. Children who engage in behavior that is hostile, they continuously seem to be pugilistic, ready to go at the parents. Anger, and anger of a pathological degree, extreme degrees of rage can sometimes be contributing to can arise out of considerable degree of emotional abuse that is going on in the child's life, especially if there has been a change. The child who was not particularly angry is now showing hostility and extreme anger. Then we have to be cautious about looking into what might have gone wrong in the child's life, including abuse, particularly emotional abuse. Some children will not show their aggression overtly, but will engage in sulking behavior or withdrawal from expected interaction. And this is called passive aggression, not complying with the parents' wishes in a passive sort of way. Next. Some will go to the other extreme. And I mentioned earlier that if a child develops enough of a sense of autonomy, realizes that he is now at a musculoskeletal level quite capable of handling people who are being cruel and rough to him, he is more than ready to give it back. And sometimes not just give it back, but rebel against society, disrespect social norms, and engage in antisocial behavior. Not a small number of antisocial individuals are people who had a very, very rough upbringing, and they are retaliating against the world in general because they've had this rough upbringing. This is not the story of most cases of ASPD. I must add that. But this is the case in a significant minority of them. Another thing that can happen is to seek fulfillment, to seek joy in life. One takes course to the hedonistic available channels, sexuality. And precocious sexuality, getting interested in sex much before its time, can happen largely because of sexual abuse, but it can happen also in the absence of actual sexual abuse, because the child has been emotionally hurt so much, he's looking for some source of gratification, pleasure, and that the pleasure that is available is sexual and can be drawn into precocious sexual behavior. The immediate consequences of child abuse are emotional disturbances such as sadness, depression, being tearful, tense and anxious, or cranky and irritable. A deteriorating performance at school, especially in core subjects, but also sometimes in extracurricular activities. Dissociative symptoms, not wanting to face the reality of what's going on. The child may have symptoms which are physically not explicable, what we used to call conversion disorder, now subsumed under the broad heading of dissociative disorders. Also taking on a different personality transiently or for long periods of time sometimes. Dissociative symptoms, getting possessed, These are the kind of things that can happen because this is the child's way of coping with the horrible circumstances he or she has to deal with. Some children will become clingers. They cannot stand separation from a caring individual because the other person in their lives, probably the other parent, has been an abuser. And this excessive or unusual dependence happens as an immediate consequence of severe emotional abuse heaped on a child. And of course, in the context of antisocial behavior, at the family level, opposing everything that the parents are trying to impose some degree of healthy disciplining, but the child wants to rebel against it and not follow the norms given by the parents. So oppositional behavior. Next. Chronicity of the abusive behavior is an important determinant of the long-term consequences of child emotional abuse. Next. The long-term sequelae are low self-esteem. We noticed that child who had got a number of labels, and when we were talking about what shapes the abuse can take, a person who's repeatedly been told he's unworthy, unworthy, unworthy through various labels, so I used only one repeatedly, can lower the self-esteem of this individual considerably. Then, of course, the standard depression and anxiety that we mentioned as an acute consequence can become more deep-rooted and the child becomes prone to depression and anxiety. Sometimes the child will resort to eating disorders, particularly bouts of overeating. And this phenomenon called bulimia occurs as the commonest form of eating disorder as a consequence of emotional abuse. Many of these children later on have difficulty relating to the rest of the world and relational problems, not being able to form deep friendships, not being able to trust anybody are common facets of the emotional consequences of emotional abuse. Then we mentioned as a need in the results of emotional abuse, a hostile tendency. Some of these individuals are so belligerent, so suspicious, so willing to treat the world as an enemy. And that can contribute to their maladjustment in society to a huge extent, leading on eventually to certain personality disorders, including what is called the paranoid personality disorders, borderline personality problems, borderline personality disorder. And many of these people also can have a tendency to develop what is called the anxious personality, or quite the opposite, personality where attention is drawn continuously towards oneself, not because one is anxious, but because one wants attention all the time. Narcissistic personality disorder. Alienation from society, a withdrawn kind of personality was thought of as a consequence of emotional abuse, but there is not enough evidence to suggest what we call a schizoid personality really results from any form of emotional abuse. Then there is something called the bipolar disorder, the illness characterized by extreme mood swings, and there seems to be evidence that people who are subject to emotional abuse in their pre-adolescent years, including sexual abuse sometimes, are much more prone to developing bipolar disorder, but the data is still raw and not quite robust for us to substantiate this. That's why it's drawn a little down and with a question mark before it. Next. I'll take another 10 minutes. Is that okay, Ashlesha?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So behavioral consequences, of course, problems in school and work. Problems in school for a younger child, problems at work for an older child. Next. Something's got stuck somewhere. Cognitive decline. A child who was bright and getting good grades is now doing quite badly. A tendency to engage in acts that are quite against the law, delinquency. Sexual precocity might lead to teenage pregnancy. Suicide attempts can occur, as we mentioned, especially if there's been huge verbal abuse, which made a child feel unworthy. Criminal and antisocial behavior occurs over a period of time. And the need for drowning one's sorrows can lead to the use of intoxicating substances, substance use, as well as including alcohol and more dangerous drugs also, can be a long-term sequelae of emotional abuse. General aggressive behavior, a tendency to be continuously out to get at the world, a tendency to flare up. And these are the people who engage in road rage later on and also engage in hostile interactions in the neighborhood. Then we mentioned, and this bears repetition, people who have been abused are much more likely to become abusers. They pick up this style of abusive interaction consciously and subconsciously from a very young age. Physical consequences are also there. Recurrent health problems, because the immunity can indeed be compromised by facing stress repeatedly. And in young people's lives, emotional abuse is not a small source of stress in their lives. So recurrent health problems. And there is something called psychosocial dwarfism, a very fantastic piece of work done in the early 60s in a Boston kind of setup in the USA. A pediatrician called Powell was studying these. These children got excellent nutrition. The state was providing them with dream meals, so to say, very good living conditions, but there was no contact. There was no physical caressing. There was no physical comforting. There was no hugging, kissing be left aside, but any endearing kind of behavior at all. And that caused these children to have a significant percentile lower rate of physical growth. And that has been called psychosocial dwarfism. Unfortunately, nobody has even looked at Powell's work or tried to replicate it over a period of time, but this is what it obtains. Eating disorders, we've already mentioned. It can go to two extremes. One is because the child is drawn away from food, becomes very emaciated, thin, and it can go to a point of even mortality, or sometimes obesity. There has been, again, speculative work to suggest that people who've been repeatedly emotionally abused might be a little more prone to cancer, but they are not the single most important factor that contributes to cancer. But if there are other genetic factors and other factors that are contributing to the cancer, and there is emotional abuse, the chances of that growing into a more malignant sort of outcome seem to be greater. Again, put at a distance because there's not enough conclusive data. We mentioned attitudes to sexuality. They can either become cold and frigid and impotent, and this is more important in the consequence of, this is child abuse, not only emotional abuse, sexual abuse occurring with emotional abuse, or sometimes they can become promiscuous because if they have some fire which should not have been kindled at that age has already been kindled in this person's life, and he or sometimes she can go after that pleasure more than anything else in life. Attitudes to life, being anxious, being very cynical, being very suspicious of people in general, can be a consequence of having faced too much emotional abuse early in life. And again, attitudes to children and their upbringing can be one of an attitude of being very harsh with their children. Of course, a compensatory mechanism can operate in those who have a good EQ, emotional intelligence. They can be quite the opposite. And suicide and attempted suicide seem much more common among people who have been abused, particularly emotional abuse of a verbal nature. The one film that I urge all of you, if you've not already seen it, to revisit, to see it, and those who have seen it can revisit it. Nobody has done a more marvelous job in our country to bring about the phenomenon, to depict the phenomenon of child abuse than this lovely movie made by Motwani, Vikramaditya Motwani, a movie called Udaan, which is the story of two boys. They are step brothers, so to say, half brothers really, in the correct English sense. They're the children of an abusive father. The first child's mother has committed suicide. The second child's mother has died under mysterious circumstances. And his father is a very technically bright person, but incapable of being affectionate to children. And the older child reaches that stage of autonomy where he gets the better of the father and rescues his younger brother. Both of them have been subject to extremes of physical abuse. And
you know that soap project I had, or that.
Please switch off your mic. This movie brings home the truth of this circumstance. And fortunately for this child, and always in Indian movies, you have a compensatory quality, because this child who is badly abused, the elder boy, actually has a gift for poetry. If you have Tare Zameen Par, the child has a fantastic artistic ability. We give the message, unfortunately, that without a saving, a Sama quality of some kind, some fantastic talent, the child is not going to be rescued. That's my only quarrel with these kind of otherwise very sensitive and good movies. But Udan is a movie that drives home the beauty of rising against abuse, more importantly, in a better fashion than anything else that I have seen. Long-term sequelae, bitterness can be so deeply ingrained. Many of you may know this guy. He was enraged when I was a young psychiatrist, and his name is Eminem. He's a rap singer, and he has this video where he's burying his mother, whom he's knocked with a shovel, and with the same shovel, he's digging her grave, and he wants to bury her. The mother was alive. The mother took him to court for having such a negative attitude to her and for publicizing the differences in such a rash and harsh fashion. But he sings, "I'm really sorry, Mama. Didn't mean to hurt you, but I'm getting back at you because of all the things that you did to me." Now, what happens to the children who don't necessarily take such a bitter stance in life and want to see their parents dead? They could sublimate it in the form of works of art, works of visual arts, works of fine art. And sometimes there is, as we see in the case of this person, a negative attitude. Reaction formation can also occur, and both forms of healthy and unhealthy, making peace or settling the equation that has occurred in the context of emotional abuse. Next. Let's look at intervention. Intervention with the child, intervention with the perpetrator, intervention with other caregivers and family. All three are very important. Getting on with the child. This is a poem I wrote during my postgraduate days. Puzzle, they call me. Some say it can never be solved. To me, I am a mystery too, that I beg you to please resolve. My tears have dried. My passion is spent. Perhaps it's all my fault. Lifelong will I repent. Don't look at me strangely, please. Even if you can't put me at ease. I am a jigsaw that was once a picture. All the pieces are there, and yet there's always one missing or one that doesn't fit. This child feels so inadequate because of the abuse that has been heaped on her for a considerable part of her life, sometimes all her younger days. We need to make sure to get this child to feel like a complete picture to the extent possible. Next. With the child, we first have to work at winning the child's confidence. And this can be done with extramural approach. We don't have to tackle the issue of abuse straight away with the child. Talk about the child's likes, talk about the child's dislikes, talk about the child's interests, talk about a book the child might have read or might be interested in, have interesting reading material available over there, have an interesting toy, have something from a recent movie available over there. Be familiar with what a child's world is. Without that, you're not going to get far. Helping the child open up and handle ambivalence. The child has two things. Please remember, for many children, they realize that the person perpetrating the abuse is also a loving parent at one level. So how do I tell you that my dad's been so terrible with me and he says these horrible things to me, because he also attends on me when I'm very sick, rushes me to hospital when I need it, gets me my favorite form of stationery. So we have to help the child handle this. And ambivalence of this nature is very common when the perpetrator of the abuse also has positive qualities. We need to have consistency in our care and concern for the child. It should not be saying, now it's 3 o'clock, after this I'm going to see my next patient, I don't have time for you. Say, I'll talk to you later. I will continue to be concerned about you. Please mail me. Please say other things. Please find another time when you will talk to me. It's not that I'm not interested in your story. Extends support beyond the abuse. Become the caring person briefly in this child's life. That briefness can last from days to weeks to sometimes years, but be prepared for that. Next. A fine balance has to be struck between the urgency of the matter and everything has to be dealt with considerable patience. The role of play, art, etc. to elicit the history is very important. We have father doll, mother doll, baby doll, and so forth available in good play therapy centers, which are available in most child psychiatry setups, but not everywhere. Or encourage the child to display what is going on in his or her mind You'll be surprised at how many children are articulate with art, though they may not be very good with words. We also help the child deal with emotions such as anger, anxiety, sadness, and very, very important, guilt. Very commonly, unwarrantedly, the child ends up feeling, I am guilty, I have caused it, I'm the person responsible. This is very true of sexual abuse, but it also goes with emotional abuse. That I did wrong, that's why daddy was so harsh to me. Reassurance is a very important element of this child's interaction with you, where you have to be giving the reassurance repeatedly, sometimes even small physical gestures like squeezing the patient's hand, patting him on the shoulder, go a long way in reassuring the child. Ensuring safety, sometimes even drastic means are called for. You might need to remove the child from an abusive environment. With the adult, contextualize the abuse. Please understand where it came from. Many young, well-meaning therapists I've noticed engage in a sort of witch hunting because they've caught on to something which is horrible, which needs to be punished, and they engage in this kind of harsh behavior with the perpetrator of the abuse, which is especially to be avoided at the beginning of therapy. Next. Address issues of emotional control. Does this individual have poor emotional control? Does he have unresolved psychological crises from his crisis or crises from early in his life? And this individual probably needs therapy more than the child needs therapy. Offer to help guide healthy parenting. Many of these parents are not aware of the different styles of parenting, how much indulgence is all right, how much participation is all right, how much should you be involved in the child's life. And if worse comes to worse, of course, legal redress becomes necessary. Next. There's a lot of denial from the person who's perpetrating the abuse, and dealing with this denial can be quite challenging. But don't rush in with moralizing. How could you do this to your child? My God, you threaten to slip her? Do not get into that. I understand. You might be revved up inside to let fly at this person who's perpetrated such cruelty, but understand where he is coming from first. Again, understanding and forgiving are two different things. Also, if we get very harsh with the parent, it could be counterproductive. This is very true, especially in the context of teachers. If and when the denial persists, more severe means may have to be adopted to stymie the evil. And this is what I referred to a little while ago about removing the child from that environment by whatever means your creative brain can think of. Many perpetrators of abuse are helped by putting them through a course of skills training in learning how to deal with young people. Next. With caregivers in the family, there are huge emotional upheavals that go on in the family. Sometimes the other family members, especially the non-abusive parent, becomes very cynical about everything. As I mentioned in the case of the wife of the alcoholic father, whose child had to go like this every time she saw her. So dealing with emotional upheavals and cynicism is important. Don't get trapped into a blame game. Who's responsible? Who said what? You're the one who caused it all. Don't get into that. Have an approach of a solver rather than a definer of problems. The clear objective must always be to protect the child. Fostering the child's healthy development after the trauma. And trauma is a word bandied about way too much. But indeed, in the context of emotional abuse, it remains very, very relevant. Next. The Japanese art of kintsugi is something which I find very, very useful in the context of therapy in general, and particularly in the context of abuse. The Japanese have this method of a broken ware of china, usually a bowl, but sometimes even a plate, sometimes even a wall hanging. They will put it back together with neat gold lining, gold filling. Now there are other substitutes that look precious. They don't have to be as costly as gold. But kintsugi, also called kintsukorai, that I learned only day before yesterday. Kintsugi is what I was familiar with, is a very good strategy as a very metaphoric message to drive home when we are rebuilding a person's life after he has been subject to abuse. Next. Kintsugi makes the broken piece even stronger and more beautiful than the original was, revitalizing it with new life. But there is something more than that, an important something. To realize that we all have cracks inside us, we are cracked and scared in very different ways. Relationships break, aspirations break, friendships break, health and wealth suffer cracks, our hopes and dreams get destroyed, and this happens quite a lot with the chronically emotionally abused child. And at times, we feel incapable of repairing ourselves. Next slide. But the sooner we start accepting our cracks and scars, the sooner we will transform into something even more worthwhile, a being that is no longer perfect, but in our imperfection, we will be perfect. So this is what somebody who underwent this kind of therapy had to say. Life is not only what breaks us, but it's also what makes us. We just have to put the pieces together and create something even more beautiful than it was before. That even more beautiful might be a way of comforting ourselves. It may not be more beautiful than what was there earlier, but certainly it is something which is still quite prizeworthy. I choose to put gold on my inner scars and wear it proudly as a badge of honor. This is a kind of paradigm I like to use in the context of therapy. There are some controversial areas. Is all punishment to be done away with? Certainly not, but we have to have a healthy attitude to punishment, and corporal punishment, punishment of the body, must be minimized, something which we need to emphasize. It isn't as though a child should never ever be physically punished, but there are contexts to it. Perhaps in the question of question and answer, we may deal with that. Abuse. Many people believe that child abuse has been made much of, but sometimes also it's important to remember that some people will exaggerate the smallest negative interaction from a parent and label it as abuse. I remember the kind of upbringing, and I said this earlier, we had, probably all of us could have taken, by today's norms, our parents to court. But we don't need to, and we're very proud of the way our parents brought us up. Abuse contributes to toughness of character. So, I mean, is that true? I think it does in some measure, but too much of it can be really, really too bad. And does abuse beget resilience? Resilience is a very important facet, thanks to Professor Michael Rutter, who was not the first person to deal with it, but who drew our attention to it and academically studied it more than anybody else. There is a relationship of resilience and abuse. People who've been abused are likely to develop some degree of resilience more than people who have not been abused. Should we therefore undergo abuse? Next slide, please. So dealing with resilience, it's innate to a considerable extent, but it can also be built up if it is not inbuilt. Is resilience a guarantee against further personal problems? In great measure it is. But sometimes, if resilience is too much, if you're too tough and will never bend, then I think you can go to the other extreme and become a harsher individual in dealing with life situations later on. Some of you may have seen the movie called Ardha Satya. This is very well borne out, but the context is not child emotional abuse. Next. Following up children who've been abused, dealing with an acute instance of abuse is not enough. Please follow them up for a minimum of at least 100 days to ensure that these things are not going on. With longer the abuse, the longer the follow-up needs to be. Also, there are dangers of underreporting abuse. Myths about our culture being ideal. I will not go into the story, but there are a lot of people in this culture, in our country, who believe that abuse is a story of the West, doesn't apply to our country, or hardly applies to our country. Hence, free use of abuse, lack of sensitivity to the issue of child abuse is something which attends on our lives. There are also dangers of over-reporting. There was a classic case of a Pakistan-born American pediatrician, UK pediatrician, who overdiagnosed sexual abuse because she found the patulous anal reflex much more common in her particular lot of clientele. That led to a big scandal. So be sensitive to the issues, but please be aware that abuse can be underreported as well as overreported. There is this other movie that I draw your attention to. We spoke about Udan. There was a very similar in theme, but not in content. The movie called This Boy's Story, very brilliantly done by Leonardo DiCaprio, and Robert De Niro as the abusive stepfather has done a marvelous role. This is a true story, and here's the author of the true story, Tobias Wolff, who wrote this story. It became a very, very telling movie on the story of abuse and how autonomy developing in a young man eventually helps him break the shackles of an abusive relationship, especially because the mother is a rather inadequate personality, succumbs to whoever is pressurizing her. But he moves on and goes on to become a brilliant professor of literature. That's Tobias Wolff. Next. Now, this is the guy, Antoine Fisher. Every child has value and boundless potential. And that even if all one has to give is an encouraging word as a genuine gesture of care, that gift alone can save a child's life and give hope for the future. So whatever you can give to an abused person, don't hesitate from giving it, provided it's positive. Antoine Fisher is the guy who wrote that first poem that I cited to you, that is about who will look after this boy who is crying. And that is the kind of individual who faced a lot of abuse. He had good therapists. His story, Antoine Fisher's story, has been made into a movie. It goes by eponymously with Antoine Fisher, that's the movie. And Denzel Washington's first directorial venture, where he also acts as a therapist. It also brings into the focus the problems that a therapist may have in his own life, which are coming in the way of his being an effective therapist. It's a very beautiful movie. If you get a chance, please see it. But please remember the message that Fisher gives us about what a small gesture can do to change the equations, to titrate the horrible things that have been happening in this acidic life that the child has undergone. Thank you very much for your patient listening. I'm sorry I've kept you for quite a long time. I didn't realize it was going to go on this long, but I hope it was sufficiently engaging for all of you. I'd like to thank the Greenwood initiative for giving me this opportunity, for Ashlesha to be nudging me to say, when are you doing it? When are you doing it? When are you doing it? It's done, Ashlesha. I'm sorry I've taken such a long time. I'm duly embarrassed, but I hope it will be useful in sensitizing people to an aspect of life that is very important in our professional careers.
Thank you, sir. No, you actually answered quite a few of the questions that we had received by mail. So thank you for such an exhaustive coverage, and also covering aspects of intervention, which I particularly found very useful and interesting to hear. I'm just going to go through some of the questions, and if you want to ask them yourself, you can. Lakshmi Rajan, I don't know if you want to ask your question out aloud. I'll just read it out, and then if it doesn't cover, then you can come in. She asks, how does exposure to violence affect the child? Like, what, I think you've covered it, but what is the impact of violence itself? I don't know if you want to add anything more to what you've said.
Seeing actual physical violence is more damaging. We have been bandying about this bit about children should not see violent films. There is more than a grain of truth over there, but I think that is a little more exaggerated. Seeing actual physical violence, and especially domestic violence, can be very, very damaging to the child. Small children can pick up a message that this is what is generally done. The mother in the family, the father in the family has to beat up the mother in the family. Very rarely the other way around also. But I think that these are messages picked up. And in play therapy, I've found this demonstrated quite commonly. The daddy comes home, this is what he does. Then he asks for a cup of tea. Mommy says, do you know what happened today? So I asked for a cup of tea. Where's my cup of tea? And that leads to to an argument, and that verbal conflict translates into physical conflict, and that can be very devastating. I think verbal and physical violence are best minimized in a family. They should not be. I agree that we'd have a generation of namby-pamby individuals if they did not see some degree of conflict at all. But that has to be, both parents have to be psychologically sensitive. We live in an age of great psychological sensitivity, and we should pay attention to how much the child is exposed to. TV violence, there are limits, and I think repeated exposure to TV violence is something which must be avoided, especially with boys, when they get addicted to seeing only violent films, where there has to be mayhem, there has to be rivers of blood flowing. That is something which is generally a very bad kind of addiction for young boys.
Thank you, sir. I think also what you were suggesting is that especially the kids learning that the way to resolve problems is by violence or by conflict, if that's what they end up seeing all the time.
Right.
Another very interesting question, and I suppose this is Ekta is asking this question. What will be considered more severe, emotional abuse, like child witnessing parental conflicts, or versus parents separating? And I'm wondering if, Ekta, if this question comes to your mind, because this is another dilemma that a lot of women say, I'm in an abusive marriage, but if I divorce, that's going to be worse for the children. So I'm staying in this marriage for the sake of the children. So if you had to compare as abusive environment, what would be more abusive? I don't know if there's a true answer to this question, but just wondered if you had a response.
Right. You're very right in guessing that there is no perfect answer to this question. And so many times I've had to deal with this situation. You and I have talked about it in a different context also, that the mothers who will later throw at the child that I stuck to this marriage for you. I didn't walk out of the marriage. And the child, having come of age, beyond autonomy, now a full-grown adult, says, why did you? Maybe I would have been much better off if both of you had separated. I could have had a decent relationship with both of you. And I think that applies in very many cases. So just sticking to a marriage for the sake of a child does not usually make enough sense to me. But there are mitigating circumstances. We haven't the time to go into nitty-gritty. There are a few marriages where I'd say that it was a good thing mother stuck to the marriage and was there with the father. Economic circumstances are not uncommon in this context, because not being sexist over here, but very commonly daddy makes more money than mommy does and better things are afforded. But then if they both are open to the idea of intervention and taking some degree of counseling to change their styles, it can go a long way.
Can I ask something, Dr. Bhide?
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
sure.
Yeah,
Can you become visible?
Oh, yes. Sure. Hi, I'm Ekta. I work at the Apollo Hospital, Delhi. I hope you can see me now.
Yes, I can see
I've
you.
heard a lot about you from Dr. Ajit Bhide.
Okay.
He's probably a colleague.
Say hi to him. I haven't met him in 20 years.
Yes, but I remember him talking very highly of you. So as a therapist, I actually, face this a lot, where, the question comes to you on the emotional health of the child. That's separate, that parents put it on the child to we are in the marriage because of you. But, as a clinician, when I see a child and I see a bad marriage or a parent having an extramarital affair or, parents fighting amongst each other, as a clinician, I always think that, okay, what would be better? Because one part of the theories say that a child wants the family to be together.
Yes,
whether
that is a fantasy for most children.
Right. Or is it more emotionally healthy for them to separate out and live with a single parent? Because like you talked about, abduction and parent alienation and a single parent being also, quote unquote, an abuse. Right. So this is a big dilemma I always face. And, I really don't know. I always tell them, when you prepare the child, you work through the marriage. But end of the day, in your experience,
it depends on how much bitterness has seeped into the relationship, how willing both partners are to undergo some kind of reconciliatory therapy. If they are, then we can give that a shot. But if they're not, my overall feeling is it's better off they separate in most instances than that they stick together for the sake of the child. And the poor child is actually being victimized by this staying together in very many instances. But as I mentioned, there are mitigating circumstances in our country, especially in the context of families that they have only one earning member. I think we have to take a broader view and say that, okay, for some time you'll stick together. And then when you have enough, you have the wherewithal to support the child adequately, or the court is going to give you the wherewithal to be able to support the child, then please move on to separation. And now you have these mediation courts, which I make fun of quite a lot. Please excuse my saying that. But sometimes these mediation courts do a good job in explaining to the parent who does not want to part with any material benefit to the other partner when they're undergoing divorce, to say that, listen, you owe this. And they've done a good job in very many instances that I'm aware of. They fail sometimes, and sometimes in spite of the court's injunction, the parent fails to pay up. These are different matters which need social legal handling rather than mental health handling. But if that can be worked out, then I think it's better they separate rather than go hammer and tongs at each other every other day.
So per se, as if you say quote unquote emotional abuse, I always follow that it is better for the child not to be on an everyday conflict, rather than separate.
Absolutely.
And then kind of learn to
Absolutely.
deal with it will be a better.
The other thing that you have to say, which I did not mention, is that the parent should be guided not to badmouth the other parent.
Each other. That's true.
Poison the child against the other parent's mind. This happens very commonly. And with the best of it. So see, we're going to a luxury hotel or resort. Mommy can't take you there. It can be as subtle as that. It need not me that your mother's an ogre, she slept with so many men. It doesn't have to go to that level at all.
Yes.
Mommy can't take you to such places. Mommy can't buy you this. These things tell on the child's mind.
Actually, that's a very interesting point you're making, sir, because sometimes that happens in parents who stayed together, and especially I'm sort of generalizing gender-wise, but it can happen both ways. If a woman is being abused by the husband emotionally, or she doesn't have a voice, often it comes out as bitterness towards the father in front of the child. Your dad doesn't do this for me. Your dad doesn't do that. Or so sometimes even if they're staying together, this emotional abuse or exposure of the flaws of the other parent to the child can become quite a difficult thing for the child to be stuck with.
Okay, you're right over there, but I'll say this much, that bitterness can take various forms. I mean, the visiting rights. पापा तो छुट्टियों पे और दीपावली पे आते हैं, बाकी का टाइम मेरे साथ ही रहना ना तुझे.
Yeah.
That's the kind of scene which attends on so many lives when there is divorce. And Papa he's really the sugar daddy. He can give whatever the child wants for those lovely breaks that are there. Does daddy have to go to the PT parent-teacher meeting? Does daddy have to sit with homework which you've been avoiding? Does daddy have to deal with the kind of company you've been keeping? He doesn't have to do that in many instances.
I guess that is also emotional abuse.
Very much.
Yeah. So another question is, there are lots of compliments. I'm sorry, I'm not reading them out.
Please keep them out. I do without them.
No, I will keep and share them with you.
No, just kidding.
Yeah. So Gayatri is asking a question. I want to know, why are the effects of emotional abuse more long lasting than other forms of abuse?
I think because emotions are something that are inside and they affect. I mean, biological psychiatry, especially in this context, is not my strong point, nor is legality, I must confess. But very importantly, they do affect the circuitry of your brain. They create a habit circuit within you that becomes difficult to break and get rid of. Physical abuse with emotional abuse will have the same effect, is what I imagine. Sexual abuse with emotional abuse. But if there is only emotional abuse that is going on, you are facing this in a chronic fashion, which causes you to be sort of primed into seeing things in a very negative light much of the time. And that is going to have a lasting effect. So you'll have attitudes of, being on tenterhooks all the time, anxious, tense, willing to break, not willing, ready to break at any moment, or take the other extreme of being belligerent, pugilistic, and wanting to go at life generally. Whoever comes your way is going to get the punch in the wrong place. So emotional abuse begets this. I also feel, when I said the spectrum of abuse, you've divided into 6 areas. They all have a huge overlap. And the one common thread among all of those, most importantly, is emotional abuse. Sorry, I'm saying this for the 7th time today, perhaps, but it merits.
But I think also it flows on with a couple of questions we had received by email, as and I think you mentioned it in your talk, where emotional abuse is harder to pick up, is harder to identify,
harder to define.
Harder to define. And I'm wondering whether, and this is related to the questions also, where people may not even realize that they're being emotionally abused. And how does one, someone's asked, how does one convince them to come for therapy? Or how do we encourage them to start opening up? So I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts. I think you covered it in your talk with regards to interventions for the child, but them not realizing this is abusive or willing to do anything about it can be also a dilemma.
That's right. It can, and we need to be the ones who convey the idea that this is bad for your child's overall growth. There's a case question from Bharav Shah. Would you care to read that?
I'll read that. So
if you want, I can do that. I have a client, an adolescent who grew up thinking she is responsible for the abuse her mother suffered from her father. Parents are overall good people, but due to some interpersonal issues, father has anger on the mother. She encouraged mother to separate, but mother doesn't want to. She wants to stay in a hostel now, but parents not willing to allow her to stay in a hostel before marriage. She doesn't want to go against them, as she doesn't want to break the tie fully. In this case, and in general, how do we support the adolescent who wants to abandon his or her family with an abusive environment. I think I would emphasize to the family, this child is in a toxic atmosphere, which is not good for his, or rather her, well-being in the long run. I think a short stay in the hostel where she keeps regularly in touch with you may do her a world of good. Lots of parents in India have grave reservations about keeping, especially girls, but to a lesser extent boys, in hostels because they'll get bad company. The fact is that we spoon feed our children for too long. I think it's good to allow them to develop a sense of independence, a sense of autonomy in the long run. And I think I would encourage hostel life beyond the age of 15, never before the age of 15. Unless it's absolutely unavoidable. Not everybody who goes to a boarding school turns out to be psychologically damaged, but the chances are much greater in the pre-adolescent years. Beyond 15, it's all right to have a hostel life, but keep regularly in touch with the parents, monitor the child's behavior, progress from time to time, find out what kind of company is available in the hostel, and take the right steps if it's undesirable company. I would encourage such a child to seek the hostel option and try and explain to the parents, if they can afford it, to go for a hostel, but not to cut off from the family entirely. Some clients, some patients have also said to me, what did my parents give me? Bitterness, 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 bitterness. Yeah, they brought me up, they put me to a good school, they could afford it. What else have they done for me? And I feel very badly for such. I can not identify, that's not the right word. I had nice parents on the whole. I can understand the depth of their angst when they say something like that, because there are children who have seen more bitterness among the parents than anything else. Sweetness was practically absent in their lives.
Does that answer your question, Harav? Yeah. So Amita is asking, are there any patriarchal influences in child abuse? For example, are girls more subject to emotional abuse while boys get more physically abused? I'm
not sure that there's any, it's a very, at one level common sense, at another level social culturally appealing model where the boys will be beaten and the girls will be verbally abused. But I think it's across, especially in urban metropolitan India, I think it's the same across genders now. And also, it used to be very commonly the fathers who were abusive. I'm seeing more and more abusive mothers. Talk about gender equality.
Reshma, I don't know if you asked this question because it's covered in the presentation. What damage control can be made when the child is scarred by the quarrels of parents, especially when there's been physical abuse of both mother and child? I think you kind of covered it in your
I think so. I think the father needs to be, rather than brought to book, the father needs to be understood. The father needs to be told this is not done, that this is, in today's world especially, very, very wrong, that he could face grave consequences at the legal level, but more importantly, if he wants his child to have some degree of self-respect and mental stability, this is very damaging. If the father does not care for any of these facets, then again, I would advocate some degree of separation. Whether we go on to a divorce or not is a moot question.
Sushma Natraj asked an interesting point. What about the effect of poor parent-child fit? Can it be called emotional abuse even if there is no overt verbal abuse or definitely no sexual or physical abuse? And what would be your view on empathy or sensitivity being innate? So I guess that's a second question she's asking. So yeah, along the same lines, if the parent and child are not fitting, or if the parent just doesn't have something like empathy, how effective can skills training be? Will it not be very mechanical and superficial? She asks.
It depends on the degree of involvement of the person who's imparting the training. If the person who's imparting the training is sufficiently sensitive to say that, hey, don't just say good morning. Say, good morning, how are you today? I'm sorry, I'm oversimplifying the thing to drive home a point. That's the kind of training that needs to be given. And it should be demonstrated. It smacks of artificiality in the beginning, as much of work in therapy does, but over a period of time, what is not, what seems artificial will become natural over a period of time. So that's the important part of social skills, generally speaking. Everything is artificial to start with. But if you're going to reject things only because they're artificial, like Scott Peck says in one of his books, then please live with your worms. Don't take anti-helminthic drugs, because that is natural.
And do you have anything to comment on the parent-child fit, where it might be?
by and large, it is, I put the onus on the parent to start fitting with the child. But of course, with hyperkinetic kids, with autistic kids, there is just so much a parent might be able to do. It's extremely frustrating for parents who have to deal with these kind of conditions and severe externalizing disorders also. So if the parent-child fit is on account of overt diagnosable psychopathology, we take a very different stance. But just that the child is more given to an outdoorsy life, but the parent is much more of a thinker, poet, a retiring type, then the parent must find somebody else who can fulfill that role. There are other significant, fortunately in this country, we have good family networks. And in spite of what's happening around me right now, there are good neighborly relations where somebody else can take that much of the role of the gender parent to see that the fitness is matched to a great extent.
There's another, just think I missed the question. Mala is asking, parents often picture themselves as ideal parents. I think this is also quite an important question, where they think that what they're doing is healthy. And this is how, what would be a healthy way of conveying to the parents that what they're doing could be hurtful to the child and can actually be damaging the child, but without hurting their parents' sentiment?
No, I think, first of all, the parents must be heard out completely about why they think they are good parents, and then find out from the child what is not matching with the child's expectations in the parenting being meted out. I think this happens much more with adolescents because younger people accept the parents such as they are, but when adolescence comes and you want your parent to be a little more liberal, or you're ashamed of the fact that your mother is not a particular kind of person, your father is not a particular kind of person. You can even be avoiding it and not having your friends come over. I've seen this happening in social contexts quite commonly. So I think we need to work on that to explain to the parents that these are the expectations of your child. Could you slightly modify your style and never run down their style of parenting if it is not something worth running down. If they've been harsh, punitive parents, certainly they need correction. But if they say that, no, I'm very used to the idea that there should be a curfew, 7 o'clock means 7 o'clock, the child should be home. I don't think we should discourage that just because the child wants to test their limits and wants to come home late.
We have a question from Ilora Barik Sil, who says that she has a client where the family doesn't seem to have abused her. So I'll just read out. It says, could you please explain on how do we as clinicians deal with the client's family who is in a pathetic state when client is not emotionally abused, but is exaggerating for her own bad intentions?
Right.
And the therapist has already explored that. Any strategies to handle such cases?
Right. So I think then we use case vignettes to say that this is what constitutes abuse. This does not constitute abuse for these reasons. That's why I said underreporting and overreporting are very important facets. And I think Elora's question is bang on the hitting the nail on the head precisely with that. There are children, I said, trauma is a subject, is a word much bandied about these days. Everybody's looking from the lens of trauma, they tell me, and so forth. Now, I think when a child is exaggerating her perception of, exaggerating her story to want to make you believe that there is massive trauma, I think you hear her out and then slowly over a period, I would reckon, of at least 3 sessions, try to turn her around to see things a little differently. You might not succeed, word of caution. You might not succeed because those who are craving for that kind of attention sometimes will go on with that style, but that is not your failure. Okay, and tell them that, listen, I think you might be overreacting a little. This part of your story is very understandable. It does smack of some degree of abuse, but I don't think it's such a horrendous story that you label your parent or parents as villains. I think they acted in good intention. They seem to have acted with good intention in this instance and this instance, but not in that instance. So judiciously hear out all the stories and give them the feedback that they might be overreacting. And this kind of overreaction in the long run is not going to serve you well in the big bad world you'll have to face anyway. Sorry, I don't think it's a big bad world. Just for
I think the point you make is valid, sir, and also exploring the reasons for the exaggeration. There must be something else that's happening, and staying with that rather than rushing to save this poor child from abusive parents. it might be useful to explore that. What is happening? What's making her exaggerate, like you said?
So there's a lovely story by Owen Wilson called Necessity's Child. At a beach resort in England, a middle-aged couple encounter this little boy who has such fantastic stories to tell them about how horrid his parents are. And they're full of empathy, and they want to do something for the child. They want to rescue the child somehow. And then the child goes home and tells his mother, you know what a story I spun about both of you. I had such a good time. I could see that the woman was almost in tears, and the story ends there. So of course that is turns out to be a comic story on the whole. But I think there are necessities children. It's called necessities child because necessity, you know, is the mother of invention. And this child is inventing a sad story about himself. But I think there are individuals who crave that attention. You're right. It's worth looking at the possibility that there is a deeper pathology, why this person wants so much artificially created concern rather than the concern he would normally get.
We are almost out of time. Well, we are out of time, but are you okay to take one last question?
I'm okay to be as long as you, when you say curtain, we'll go.
Yeah. Rachna Kakkar said, I have a 37-year-old female client who finds it difficult to learn new skills, especially work-related skills, and this is impacting her professional growth. She shared that her mother used to hit her daily to make her study in childhood, and the same thing didn't work with her younger brother. So the brother went scot-free. She feels this had affected her academic skills and is affecting her even today. So she's just asking for suggestions on how to help with this. Although it's physical abuse, but like you said, it's probably occurred in the context of emotional abuse as well.
Right. And I think we have to, I'm sure you've spent a lot of time with this individual. Don't imagine you will necessarily be able to turn things right around. We have this omnipotent, the delusion of omnipotence that many therapists have, that we can change everything. So tell her that within limits, I will be able to help you to move on, not to get stuck at the stage where sorry, you have these horrible experiences that are not going to go away merely through narration, but we have to make our peace with what we have, and let us analyze what prevents you from picking up these new skills. Can you go at a slower pace to pick up newer skills? If you slow down and use the brake a little more than the accelerator, chances are that you might pick up skills. Are there people who could tutor you? Shall we look for such tutors in your particular skill? If you're going to be frowned on by your organization where you can't pick up those skills, could you spend a little and learn these skills from outside? And please don't go on with this grudge that you rightly bear, because that grudge is going to be an impediment to your personal growth.
Thank you, sir. On that note, we will wind up for the day. If anyone has any extra questions, you can email them to us, and I will see if Dr. Bhide wants to be harassed later on to respond to them.
I'd be delighted to. I am a slow but definite correspondent. My email address I should have put, but I normally put at my presentations. I forgot. So it's drajitbhide@gmail.com. DRAJIT. There's no H over there. In the South, we tend to put an H with Ajit. AJITBHIDE@gmail.com.
I'll just write it out down. Is that correct, sir?
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So thank you once again for, it was a really illuminating and enriching talk. And I'm glad we, had lots of questions discussed as well. Thank you for bringing your cases and questions. And we hope to have, come and present to us again at our future expert talks. Thank you once more.
Look forward to attending the other expert talks. Somehow I've been able to make the time for it. Thank you all for your participation, and thank you for giving me this opportunity, Ashlesha and Green Oak Initiative.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.